For this fourth podcast of the Atlantic Thread series, curator Cindy Sissokho, artist Afrah Shafiq, architect Olufèmi Hinson Yovo, artist, author and curator Olivier Marboeuf discussed their shared experience in Salvador de Bahia, Brazil, in November 2025 as part of a residency at the PivôSalvador Art Center. The Atlantic Thread project, within the framework of the 2025 France-Brazil season, is supported by the Institut Français du Benin and the Instituto Guimarães Rosa and sponsored by Petrobras. It is carried out by the Instituto Cultural Acropole through the Federal Government of Brazil, Cultural Incentive Law, Ministry of Culture. Afrah Shafiq residency was supported under the Together program of the Swiss Arts Council Pro Helvetia New Delhi and in partnership with Pivô, FHNW Basel and the Samdani Art Foundation. Olufèmi Hinson Yovo researches have been supported by African Artists Foundation. So welcome in the fourth podcast of Atlantic Threads, just the one relate to our common experience in Salvador. It's a new episode that is really dedicated to what us four, I will present the four speakers, did and try to do at Salvador de Bahia in Brazil, in echoes of what we did before, and talk about when we were in Paris. So today we're gonna talk with Olufèmi Hinson Yovo, which is an architect from Benin, Afrah Shafiq, which is an artist from India, Cindy Sissokho is the curator of the program based in London, and me, Olivier Marboeuf, which is artist and curator based in Paris. So to start that conversation, the first thing it will be, the first part of the conversation will be more centered about our particular experiences during the month of last November 2025 in Salvador de Bahia. And first speakers, I would like to ask to Olufèmi to talk about the shows. He did that because you were a very important part of the program as an architect. You brought a show in Salvador de Bahia, and I would like you to speak about how the reception of the show on one hand, and how your research about architecture have been implemented about that experience, in particular in Salvador.
Yeah, thank you, Olivier. So Salvador has been a wonderful city to kind of like being there. First of all, because I'm from Benin and we have strong link with Salvador. So it was such a great opportunity for me to be able to expand and unfold my work within that geography, and also to get a sense of what the Afro-Brazilian and other Afro-Brazilian community would have a look at my work and how they could engage with that and what perspective that could unfold in their imaginary and in the information as what is the architecture of the West African country linked to the architecture in Salvador. So basically my ongoing research and for architecture and curation has been about West African architecture in general and the different links to different geographies of the world. So firstly, I focused on West African architecture through the different period. So from traditional architecture to modern, postmodern, contemporary, different kind of like shapes and form of architecture. And in the case of Salvador, it was the aim was kind of like to bring geographically those two type of architecture, not only the West African architecture we know as it is, and also kind of like have an overlay of that from the West African architecture to the architecture located in Salvador and also in different part of Brazil. So we kind of like conducted a sort of let's say imaginary map of that Atlantic, so different coast of the Atlantic, also in a point of view of the cartographia invertida. So also having like a different point of view, looking at at the work from that point of view, and then overlaying different archives of architecture that I have been collecting for the last probably 10 years or so. So it was also an exercise of engaging with the public, because I, as the artist and curator, put like the first layers of architecture, and then it was interesting now to give the hand to the public to now engage with the existing work with construction of a different imaginary. So we had like different postcards, and people could now place on this huge map. They could like contribute to the word and link some different typologies to whatever geography they wanted. And it was quite interesting because there was no limit. It wasn't the case of being realistic or utopian. It had to be free for whoever wanted to participate. And what's very interesting was that I had put a little bit of existing structure there, and then I wanted the rest of the public to engage with. And it was rather interesting engaging with the public, how they perceived different places and some of the placement they would have, and the discussion we would have around them, deconstructing some of their vision and actually linking different things that they wouldn't expect. So they will probably place some things from West Africa, they will place it in the Amazon or different places. So it was rather interesting to actually see how, looking at the climate of those places, some architecture typologies could literally travel everywhere. We also had like some architecture from Paris, from Niemeyer, who a lot of people thought it was literally from Brazil, but it was also in Paris. So there was that construction, that I would say mind construction of the word, which is different from the existing framework that we have. So that was this sort of gray zone of existing slash construction slash acquired knowledge of the word and typology of architecture. So it was rather interesting in that sense. And the discussion with the people coming from that exercise were quite nurturing in that regard.
Yeah, can you perhaps tell us more about the question of archive that was a part of your reflection? So it was in one way sharing different typologies and creating, as you say, a new geography with new perspective, because I think we all share the fact that in a certain way being in Brazil changed our perspectives, because none of us is Brazilian. But on the other hand, you try also to bring the idea of producing an archive, which in that case was also a reflection about an African and Afro-diasporic practice of the archive. Can you say more about that?
So for me, archiving has become a tool of research, because we are in this very rather a quick evolving world where lots of cities are in transformations, and there's a lot of like gentrification and lots of different urban developments that are kind of like coming in different part of West Africa, let it be Cotonou or Dakar or Abidjan or even Salvador itself. So and oftentimes, past architecture is often more attuned with the climate. So it often has some wonderful lessons for a young architect who want to design, because you think about shading, passive ventilation, louvers, things like that. So even technically and also in a way of visual as well, the archives hold lots of meaning and lots of knowledge. So then archiving became a practice of mine, trying to like gather all of this information as much as I can across West Africa, and now also in the case of Salvador, and actually looking at how those archives can actually talk to each other. So my practice of archiving is a little bit, is very personal and very intimate and very sensible. It's not something that is rather set or scientific, but it often looks at the value of the building within the community, its value as an architecture heritage, and its value to people or linked to the people. And what I also discovered archiving and kind of like looking at different buildings is also that lots of community have a very strong attachment to a lot of buildings. They have memories there, they have personal history, and oftentimes what happens is that once the development happens and things change, that community, that invisible link, that kind of like easily erased. So this is also a way of remembering different places for communities as well, etc., etc. So this is how I kind of like guide my archive, and now it's building. Every time I come to a new geography, I try to kind of like also get a sense of that in a different place as well.
And just to jump in a little bit, because we've all seen this really great exhibition, which was very meaningful in the context of Salvador, but also, again, as you say, Femi, you bring that with your own research that is very much based on West African architecture predominantly, but many other things as well. This exhibition also was, through that inverted map, as you say, was an opportunity to also play with the imaginaries behind the archive that you've managed to gather. No, all of these different postcards that were printed represents those diversity of spaces, of buildings, of sites that have different meanings, whether they are spiritual, they are religious, they are others, administrative. I mean, it was very diverse in that sense. But what happened in that room also was that you opened up, a window to think through other spaces from the space of Salvador, and to really, again, activate in quite surprising ways those different dialogues that were not necessarily existing as well. And I think bringing it back to the context of the Atlantic Thread projects as well is to really think from that loss. And that's also the title of your project now, Archiving the Lost with the Lost. Archiving the Lost, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. Actually, it could be with. It's really about thinking about those invisible traces, those things that we think don't exist, but how actually are very much part of that collective memory, that collective imagination. So really that exhibition was very symbolic to also bringing back some of the conversation from the Paris immersion earlier in 2025 to Salvador in a very different symbolic contemplation of those connections, which again connect with the Atlantic as a thinking political space beyond that geography of we're thinking from West Africa to Brazil or Brazil to Africa. It's bigger than that. It's opening up to another map, another cartography of those histories as well.
Yeah, just let you perhaps, Olufèmi, add something about that remark by Cindy, and afterwards we'll jump with Afrah, just to echo to that practice of archive, which is very central in what she experienced in Salvador too.
Of course, one thing I can add is that I really like Cindy's comment, because oftentimes as the artist or the practitioner, we often don't have the enough recul to think about our work. And I really enjoy how Cindy is describing this new link and space that was formed within this exhibition to Salvador as a place, because it's literally the first time my work has been showed elsewhere from West Africa or Europe. So to come in such a symbolic space and then to being able to expand the vision of West Africa in that space was something that was quite fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, Cindy just also underlines about the material-tech practice, the collection of material, which can be also perhaps an aspect of the archiving, because we talk about images since then, but we all know that there is, of course, the physical dimension of the archive. The body one have been really in the center of reflection of what the Atlantics produce, but sometimes we underestimate also the materiality as a form of archive, the soil, the plants, and all those things. I do think that you touch, Femi, about that question in your work about the materiality, because you're an architect. I'm sure also Afrah will have some things to say about that just after you.
So I thank you for this point. What was also very interesting was to bring back some of the elements of the different building that were in Benin now, to bring them to Salvador, and this building from like the 1900 that I was collecting personally. So this exhibition was simply a continuity of my own practice, where I was able to come and show my different type of archive, let it be photographic material or even like soil or things like that. So, and I think that's segment of the exhibition really touched a lot of people in Salvador, and I had lots of comments about how it was interesting to touch the materiality and have a sense of also spatial kind of like speciality instead of just like flat images. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just to ask now to Afrah about our own experience, research, relation with archive, and intersection with the same kind of question we talk about Femi, about the reception, the conversation with the locals, but also memory and materiality of the archive. Afrah, you want to tell us a bit about your research you brought in Salvador and you developed there?
Yes. Hi, thank you. I think my opportunity to come to Salvador was sort of accidental, and I think that maybe accidents are really, or unplanned visits are a really good way to allow for the unexpected, which was a good tone for the rest of the Salvador trip that followed. So when I was kind of invited to Salvador, I immediately knew that I have this ongoing interest with the Marian figure, or the kind of the icon of Mother Mary, that I've been exploring, especially in Goa, where I live, but also in other parts of the world, especially in countries where religion and colonization were introduced at the same time, and where there were sort of larger religious practices outside of Christianity that existed, and the ways in which the Marian icon becomes a container to unpack those histories. And so the interest in this sort of Marian representation, devotion practice for me doesn't usually come from a religious place, but more from a way to enter more hyperlocal histories or phenomenons that are practiced in the contemporary but are linked to these sort of political histories. And with Goa and Salvador on paper, it just felt like two parallel histories in some ways. Both were colonies of the Portuguese, both are coastal cities. There are so many movements of the flora, fauna, vegetation that has gone back and forth. There are similarities in cuisine, the language. And so it felt like it felt like an obvious extension to that project. And of course, Goa has also got very, very rich syncretic history, or like syncretic practices more than history that reflect on the history. And I was, whatever limited reading and limited sort of exposure to the world of Salvador that I had before getting there made me feel like this would be two parallel worlds that I could look at in relation to each other. And I think almost everything that I witnessed was totally outside of, I think, maybe what I had imagined, in a way that I feel is a good more than lesson. I think it's a good exercise in thinking about what one, when you work with research and with archives and with lived moments, what one enters with as expectations maybe, or preconceived ideas of what one would find versus what you do end up witnessing, and how you make place and sense of the gaps between the two, and maybe in some way. So in Salvador, I witnessed, I visited Aparecida during the feast, and Aparecida is the most visited sanctuary of Mother Mary in the world. And it was obviously a huge, huge, huge public event, which I kind of was filming, talking to people. There's, a lot of devotional practices that are almost format-based, which repeat every time there is the feast. So you have certain walkways on the highway, for example, where devotees walk for days together, and there are camps where they stop for like rest and food or a massage or whatever. And so just starting from that journey to the sanctuary, to unpacking the histories of that particular icon and where she was found and how she's linked to the most significant thing being that she is the Black Madonna, and what that means for a history that is so linked with slavery, and what it means for the ways in which an entire city's very stable commerce is now supported by this tiny icon that and this sort of contemporary way in which religious tourism, for example, functions, etc. So I think I spent a lot of time at Aparecida just witnessing in whatever ways I could, ranging from conversations with people to looking at the Museum of Aparecida and the histories of the icons and the documents around that, but also really looking at different ways in which those devotional practices play out in terms of gestures, in terms of rituals, in terms of, for example, the room. There's something called the Room of Promises, and looking at that Room of Promises as an archive, which it is an archive, and the church is probably not really for the framework of the sanctuary. It is a proof of faith, but it also parallelly is an archive of faith. So you have, photographs and photographs of people with broken bones who've sent their photos to Aparecida for healing, or photographs of children who were born after a prayer to Aparecida and then named Maria. So it's hundreds and hundreds of Marias plastered on the wall, and what these archives mean, or what the wishes look like, etc. And so that was one part of the research. And then I kind of extended this into visiting certain institutions, both in Sao Paulo and in Salvador, but museums of sacred art, or the Munkabi, which is, what does it stand for? Mafro and Munkabi, which is the Museum of Brazil Art, and I'm forgetting what the full form of Munkabi is. But kind of looking at those, but when it outside of these exercises of research and like the directions in which I was allowing myself to kind of explore, I think in bringing it back to the archive in some way, I think when I started working with archives maybe almost 10 years ago, I think I worked in very institutional frameworks and visited certain collections that fit within certain institutions, even though I was interested in the margins of those archives, or the things that maybe were not so implicit within those archives, or what was missing inside those archives, etc. But I do think I still worked a lot more within the framework of an institutional or formal archive. And I think over time, my relationship to archives is slightly shifted, in the sense that I think my practice now is making archives. I'm kind of trying to create the archives that I wish existed. And so how can you enter spaces that you then try to be some kind of channel, maybe just witness, gather, glean, collect, watch, listen, and then create the archive that should have always been there in some way.
Yeah, it's a very nice way of phrasing things, and I think we do all share about that question you just addressed, so switching from looking for archive then producing for archive. And Cindy, you want to react about that last point by Afrah?
Yes, I mean, I wanted to also emphasize in the fact that the archive, I feel for all of us, really is not necessarily what people would think about. So the kind of paper-based, maybe photographic, and we were talking about that with Femi in terms of the materials, holding that memory and holding that power of the archive in itself for what we can think of differently, creating an archive. But what was very surprising also, in the context of Afrah, because I remember, we were spending time and, there were lots of different visits that each of us were doing in the city that were connecting back to our interest. And you were spending hours photographing also murals inside churches, specific churches. And I was like so admiring that, because, that in itself became a sort of a seeds to works that you will be producing as well, to a whole kind of research that you're thinking of creating, of making those connections to where you can see in the context of India and Goa, specifically where you live. So there are these like really, immaterial way to think about the production of an archive that's also comes from very physical elements. No, so these fresco, they have a specific name. I mean, they come from the right? They're
azulejos.
Exactly. So these were like a sort of obsession for you as well, but they are very much part of the archive as well. No.
And there is something that perhaps you can respond to that, adding the layer about the games you create. So the idea of playing the archive, I would say, because we talk about researching from archive, inventing archive. So practicing or playing the archive as you play a record or as you play with a game.
Yeah. I mean, I think also like, what is an archive? What is a collection? What is the framework of me as an artist is bringing to this collection that is thinking in terms of archiving? And I feel like sometimes I think that it's almost like a detective game, especially when you're out in research, like everything is relevant and nothing is connected at some point till you start seeing everything linked in some ways, So especially when I get into like some sort of early research stage, the possibility is so broad that I find it really difficult to explain to institutions or to places that I'm going to visit, what is it that I'm looking for, because I don't already know, and I want to see what is there, and then what that recalls. But then there is always a question. There is always an intention with which you enter a world. But I feel like maybe it's always helpful, even though sometimes it feels very daunting, to not already know what you're looking for. And I think the azulejos were that sort of unplanned interests that happened to me around the trip, also because it felt really I wasn't interested in azulejos before I got to this trip because it felt kind of obvious. Like, yes, there are azulejos everywhere in Goa. Yes, of course, Salvador has them too. There's so much work already been done on azulejos that it didn't really feel linked to anything that I was doing. But I think it was Bonfim, the church that I'd gone to, and it was really, really crowded. So I had no place to enter for the Sunday Mass. And I was standing in the corridor outside. And for almost the 2 hours of the Mass, I could only see the azulejo, which was opposite me. So I started looking at it a lot more carefully than I might have otherwise. And a lot of the scenes are biblical scenes. You have Annunciation, you have the Stations of the Cross, etc., etc. But then I started kind of noticing the vegetation, and the vegetation was the same as what you would find in Goa: the palms, the coconut. You have cashew. You had a Marian figure holding a cashew in her hand, and so although the sort of ways in which the characters or like the biblical figures were imagined was still within this more European framework, somehow the world they were in was local. Just in terms of what were the elements around them. And I felt like this was an interesting entry point for me to look at those. I mean, it was a good way in which multiple histories across Salvador and Goa could be literally sort of seen as parallels that they were, although not necessarily just parallels. And so I kind of got interested in this form. And the other thing that really was a happy surprise, or just like a little aha moment with the azulejos, is at the San Antonio Chapel. A lot of the azulejos had fallen off. They were in a bad shape. And the restorers put them back in the wrong order. So they looked completely garbled, like a glitch almost. And this became this like clue of a possible form, and this idea of play, the puzzle, the pieces moving from here to there, the histories that are kind of separate but together make sense, don't make sense. And so that became some spark for a possible future work. And I got obsessed with photographing them for these reasons.
Thank you. It's very nice and it's very rich. I will try to jump quickly on an echoing of what you says to talk about my own research. I really like the idea that Afrah brought, that the problem with the research is that you can't confess to the institution who invite you that you don't know what you are looking for, which is mostly my case, and is a very important statement for me. I had the chance to visit for 1 month before November Salvador, so spend 1 month. And I did produce a fresco for the sample biennial, but you're supposed to be a good professional and to come somewhere with a really clear idea and be able to give some plan to people what you're going to do. And I got really always that idea that is very important in the Caribbean epistemology, is that you don't have to look for the path will come to you if you are the right person. So meaning is really a state of mind, a way of behaving and being in relation with the visible, but also the invisible of a city, the invisible layers. And so that aspect for me is very important. And also, of course, in the story of the Atlantics, there is also really the idea of repairing the history and repairing the memory that include working on speculative practice of history, or what Ariela Azoulay called potential stories, meaning some possibilities that is not the same way of working like anthropologists or scientists that would look at what's happened, but for me it's what could have happened. And what could happen in the future is a very important way of preparing our relation with time and space, especially for, of course, the African and African diasporic culture. And so my work is really based on that. When I'm in Brazil, there are some layers that, like you, Afrah, you said, there is layers that are very kind of evident. And so people would say the Afro-Brazilian culture in relation with the Afro-Caribbean culture seems to be some connection that are very evident. But other things that evidence is really a trap. So you have to look for something else that's what is stand on the surface. And for me, it's also a movement from, I will call it from the metaphorical level to a more materialist level. Of all the ideas about the Atlantics, I personally not a fan of it. You know, the notion of the Black Atlantics as a metaphor, I'm totally not interested in that. I shouldn't say that, but it's very important to put, because I'm super interested in what's happening now and what's happened for real, and not only on the metaphors. And so, for instance, I'm not the kind of person that think that the African and Afro-descent people are liquid population. We are living on lands. Even I'm coming from an island, but an island is a land. And Brazilian people are living on lands. And so the idea of course, of how that Afro-diasporic culture and Afro-confluential culture, as they call it in Brazil, create a very particular relationship with the land. And I will say a relationship is not based on the ownership, but it's based on that idea of reciprocity, what I give to the land, what the land gives to me, and all the connection with the visible and the invisible with the land have been very nourishing for me. And really on the level of the hyper-local way of doing that, for instance, how the terreiro are not only images of something, but a very concrete relationship with the land, with the vegetal dimension, with the spiritual. So the spiritual come with a lot of material, you know, is vegetal, is non-human forms, and all that help me, and I think help all of us to land to a spiritual level that is in a way very material and very concrete. When sometimes standing, especially in the world of art, in a very metaphorical level, we are dealing with ideas we don't experience. And for me, it was very important to say, okay, but what does it mean to spend a full day in a terreiro until the night? What does it mean that to build a space around a tree, and the tree really standing in the center of the place, and the place is really, what does it mean to protect a land and space, spiritual, but also social and political, in the middle of the very radical urban construction of cities in Brazil, and how it can help to think about the question of sovereignty. That is something for me super interesting to say, because I do defend that the African legacy in the Americas is for me based on that dream of sovereignty. And so there is a political proper African political statement that is on the base of the Haitian Revolution. I'm reading a book that is present, and the author is presenting also the Haitian Revolution as composed by 70% of people born in Africa, but never people who will tell you that the Haitian Revolution is a model of the political imagination of the Africa. But those people are mostly born in Africa. So I think it doesn't mean that they are Afro-descent. They were born. They were born, meaning their imagination is really grounded in a certain relation of sovereignty and desire of sovereignty, autonomy, and liberty. And so I really find a way to connect with the Africans, not in a kind of metaphorical way, but in a really political and material level. How people relate to land here and can be related to land elsewhere. Because really defending the right of Black people being people from the Americas is a very important battle that seems to be under steam and just also conceived from the North American perspective, where the Caribbean is the question and the Brazilian is a really core of another way of dealing with that. And what was really precious for me, it was also the connection and the dialogue, or the lack of dialogue, depending where, in between indigenous imagination and Afro-descent imagination. What is still possible to do, what have been done through the Quilombo, how the Quilombo is a model of that intersection, but how it can be a model of something to do. It's not already done, it's still an ongoing, and also the intersection with Asian people that travel a lot in that part of the world. How could we compose a non-Occidental center imagination? And Brazil, for me, have been really precious. And so taking the time to not to jump in the first thing that was presented to me, but say, okay, let's take some time. Perhaps there is more connection in that. Perhaps, and in the matter, and at the end of the day, I work a lot about the matter and the way in the carnival in Brazil, but not the main one, but really the minor one. People use painting and paint the skin with coals. What's happened in Haiti and in Guadalupe was this connection into a very thin material dimension, is how you deal with your skin to become something and somebody else, and how that archive can be a very thin surface on the skin that is based on the vegetal and the fire and all our landscape and the memories content on the very thin surface. As in an architecture, you can say you build really the solid part, but there is the skin of the building. And I do think that the question of the skin, out of the question of the color of the skin as an epistemology of the color, but what you put over your skin as a kind of other political skin, and have been very fruitful for me. And crossing everything you say, in one hand, the materiality, on the other hand, the necessity of creating a speculative archive that is a way of free ourselves from the ache of the history and the ache of the memory, to say, okay, but we have to build the present, and the present is based on the living archive, which is not only the past. And just to finish that, is a way to come back to how the America's time and African time is functioning, and Indian one too. The notion of the spiral, that means the archive is not the past, the archive is the present and the future in our whole practice. And I think it's a really clear connection in between all we did. So Cindy, for the last part of the podcast, is the place is yours, also echoing with what we said about archive, but also, and I think there is a lot of connection of your own research in Salvador and the reflection you brought here. Can you tell us more?
Yes, absolutely. And I think I just wanted to firstly, connect the dot with what you just said, Olivier, because there was a lot of different elements, a lot of textures of what resonates with everyone here. And more specifically, this notion of time in relation to the archive. I think it's very important. No, it's not about thinking through or with the archive or making archive in a way that is very linear, that connects with our own, lives firstly, but it really transcends other spaces. And really thinking about the past was, for me, impossible to leave behind. No, this idea of the circularity of how the history in Salvador was unavoidably connected to very real conditions today in that sense and in that geography, but also in others, but also how the city in itself, and we've been talking about it as this living archive once again, maybe there are other terms to connect to it, but how every street, every monument, and we can talk also about the importance of the monument in itself, how we understood it architecturally speaking, how we understand it and navigating that city, and how it holds back to many eras of that history, whether it's pre-colonial or colonial, and specifically in relation to the slave trade, which is everywhere. It's so heavy in many senses. It has a lot of legacies today, even in the ways in which the city itself and its infrastructures are occupied, are managed, politically speaking, but economically speaking as well. And in regards to, being in Salvador, I'm a curator. I'm not necessarily producing in a sense. I don't have a practice, or I'm not an artist. So my practice as a curator in such a city was really thinking through again that history that is non-linear, but also connecting it back to the personal. I'm always connecting with my own histories in the sense that I navigate spaces and understand also the resonance of research that I want to produce. And for me, having a sense of a specific history that is still overlooked, which is really looking at the Muslim community in Brazil or in the Americas more generally, was sparked very strongly in that context, and more specifically around the history of the Malay and the revolt in 1835 that took place in Salvador. And again, the sites in the city, the monuments in the city, the streets, but also the ways in which it had that presence has historically connected to the, or at least being absorbed within Candomblé religion or other cultural practices in Salvador were not obvious, are not so known, but however were discovered through conversations and encounters during that time in Salvador. And these kind of sparks of surprises of this different exploration were for me very unusual, but also again making that direct connection between what was thought as a disconnection between West Africa and specifically Muslim communities with Salvador, with Brazil, with the Americas, and not necessarily understanding the more recent, let's say, history of Black presence in the context of Salvador as well. And so one of the key meetings that we had, and it was with you, the first one with Silvana Olivier, and then later on we continued that conversation. I mean, it was really powerful in many senses, was bringing that question of, through her projects as a urbanist and a researcher, she worked on a project of uncovering the history of a multi-layered drowning of the history of the Malay, specifically in the context of a cemetery and in fact, right next door to the place in which we spent most of our time in the Pivot, the institution that was hosting us, how that dialogue in itself of the cemetery in the city actually represented the erasure of that community at the time and still until today in the context of the national history and local history of Salvador. And so this project was really outstanding in many senses, because it was asking also how the memory of the Black presence is also hidden in many senses. It's hidden on the ground, it's hidden, but it's kind of reappearing at the same time. There are many ways in which that project uncovered spiritual connections, religious connections, social connections, and how, in fact, these ancestors were coming back and are coming back, whether we want it or not. This archive of their lives and this archives of that history is constantly making different signs in the ways in which we navigate that place as well. And this really was not only, it's, for me, it's really kind of mind-blowing project, but in the sense that I understood this idea of the archive as something that is really bodily as well. It's something that is really connected to the land in many senses, that it is present in Brazil, in Salvador specifically, but again, in the context of the people that were present in many other forms as well. And this led me to kind of go and visit other sites, such as a mosque. I mean, the only mosque in Salvador. I wouldn't say Bahia, because it would be very ambitious for me to say that is the only mosque in the entirety of the region. But I know that the Muslim presence in Brazil is more in São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, in the bigger metropolis of Brazil. But this very small mosque, which really but is located in Nazaré, so our neighborhood again. So in many senses, the residency became a very local or hyper-local research in many senses, no? Really thinking the place of the cemetery, the place of the mosque in the same neighborhood allowed in itself to create a sort of a site, no? A contained site within the bigger city that I understood again as the kind of archive of those histories. But the mosque in itself was bringing back the history of the research behind Silvana's project into the contemporary life, into the contemporary reality of that community today in Salvador, which is very tiny, very, very small, but brings different textures and different conditions to what I understand and what I know in the context of France, for example, with the Muslim community that really are perhaps some of the most oppressed communities in that context. So there was here many different senses of time and different senses of spaces that I understood by just being in Salvador, and what this could bring to another reflection of personal histories that connect unavoidably to other forms of archive that my body was there, but actually the bodies of ancestors were present in that space and are creating another archive to uncover in many senses.
Yeah, it's really, I'm really interested in what you said, to add just something, remarks about that. I'm working a lot on because I think the question of the ancestor have been a kind of trend of the contemporary art, and the world is overused now. And it's the problem for us, because sometimes there is something to dig in, but it becomes a so huge, again, metaphorical use that prevents you of doing what you should do. And I found a way that reading Avery Gordon book called Spectral Matter, and she says, yes, but I think ghosts, our ancestors will protest, and they are manifestation of resistance. So it's exactly the opposite of the idea of ancestor as a currency that will be neutral. You just have to grab them and put them in there. They are protesting. And so they are manifestation of something this is not solved. And so they are bringing problems. And I like that other perspective, instead of creating something very neutral and domesticated again. The body of the ancestor is not a domesticated body, is not also a kind of available and disposable matter. It's something that is protesting. So you have to deal with the fact that things have not been totally solved, and it's an unsolved matter. And I like that idea, instead of the way it's used in a very, I will say, I would say immature way of using the ancestor as something that can be used and removed from here to there, especially with when we know the story of the slavery and how the body have been considered as removable from here to there. And so I do think that when you say you put your body and you create a relation, you are in relation with also unsolved situation and manifestation of protestation, which is a stronger task that an artist in that case have to create some, I will call, mediation, which are not pacification, but transformation of that state of the body to something that we don't really, it can be different things. But I do like that idea, because it brings the responsibility of the mediation to on the shoulder of the artist, the curator, and the architect, and so on. Instead, the easy way of saying, I'm going to call the ancestor doing just a dance for a contemporary art exhibition. I'm sorry to say it that way, but I think it's very important.
It's very important.
Yeah. And I do think that the relation that create all the things we present is also a question of responsibility. So it's not so often that we talk about the art practice, artistic practice, research practice as also based on responsibility. You are somewhere, you create some connection, and it's an effort to engage yourself in what you are doing. And I do think everything we say are really related to that. Create that living archive is also a responsibility of what we are doing, and including sometimes the fact we don't really exactly know where we are going, and Afrah introduced that, and I really like that because I do think that it's something that we have to be able to deal with, because the art and the creation and the curation have also to be based on the fact that we are looking for something we don't know what it is. And it's a very singularity of our practice in comparison with other practices, and we have to defend that. I'm sorry, I don't know what I'm looking for, but I hardly invest in doing something. So I'm very responsible of what I'm doing, even if I can't tell you what it is. And so it's related to invisibility in a very nice way, I would say. So I would like to ask you perhaps a last word to close that podcast. And Afrah, and after Olufèmi and Cindy, the ground will be you to just the last conclusion.
I think for me, one of the things that I'm sitting with right now post the Salvador trip is I had a show about the Mary research just a month after coming back from Salvador. And my idea was to bring my Salvador research, the Brazil research, into the show. And I think to understand the stupidity of that was my learning from this trip, because I feel like sometimes things are way more complex and way more deserving of time than you might have thought of. And after agonizing over it for a long time, I decided that I'm actually not ready, and neither is the idea. And to make something before something ripens is actually not good for the world or anyone else involved. But it's hard sometimes as an artist to be like, oh, but I can't, or I don't know, or I need to know more, or whatever. But I think this knowing in the body after agonizing and after being like, I'm not ready, it feels very right. And I'm in a place, and I think that this was the gift for me from the Salvador trip, to also acknowledge the part of the responsibility is to allow to really have something to say before you say it in some way as a practitioner. And this is where I'm at with this trip.
Thank you for your sincerity, because I do think it's very an important statement you made.
Yeah. For me right now, I'm actually at home, and there is a church called Christiani Celeste praying. They pray all day, so you probably hear a little bit of that noise, which is also interesting because they were all white and they walk barefoot in Cotonou, so we hear a bit of the music. And then concluding on the Salvador trip, I wanted to say that there was something very blissful about the hospitality of Salvador, in the sense that as a Beninese person, I felt way much more nurtured and way much more nurtured and held, and in the sense that it was a place that I felt as if I had been before, especially with the food and things like that. So for me, bringing West African architecture back to Salvador was an act of grace, and I was very I'm very thankful for that. And then finally, something that has been discussed a lot within the residency is our responsibility as artists and curators to be in those institutional places, and how we can make sure that our point of view is not diluted into the different dynamics of the art world. And that brings to Olivier's work about Sortir de la Plantation, which is also I will let you translate that more, but I really enjoy that concept, not just as a concept, but as a practice. And there's some point of view that I try to embed in my practice more. So I don't know where that is going, but it's something that I'm trying to sit with a lot more. Yeah. Thank you.
Maybe we can mention what it is, this word that really resonates, aquilombarse or aquilombar.
Yeah, aquilombar is the verb, but the term is aquilombamento. And it's also a way of taking a situation, the quilombo, as that place that have been created by enslave people that fly from the plantation and create that kind of place of autonomy in relation with indigenous also epistemology and practices. So a kind of utopian that become indeed in the region of Bahia and elsewhere in Brazil some reality, some concrete space of autonomy out in a way of capitalism too. And so a kind of radical alternative. And the idea of that, what I'm like to it's aquilambamento for the verb of aquilombarse. It's also a form of becoming. And I do think that it was very important for me also to say about the experience in Brazil, even in comparison with North America and Canada, I've been a lot of time, that there is less, in a way, a reflection about the Blackness as an ontology, but more as a becoming, as a practice of becoming. So considering that we are still on the way of understanding what kind of human being we want to be, refusing the shape and the definition of the Western world of what human beings are, and looking for a humanity that we're able to confess that we didn't find yet. So the becoming of the Americas, which is also a kind of confluences of the Asia, of the Africa, of a lot of different places. It's quite exciting. So I like the way that the Quilombo didn't become a kind of stable place, but permanently a becoming human. A way to become more human that we are at the moment, and we get nowadays with the danger world we're living in. That the switch is not in between that part of the world or the other part, but it's between the kind of a sort of human and other way of being human. So that idea that is very in the center also on the Americas of the notion of pluriverso. And the notion of there is space for different universe and space for different humanity. So it's a really anthropological switch that's happening now. There is no negotiation. And the people from the Quilombo, like Nego Bispo says, I don't want to negotiate with those people that call themselves human. We just are something else. And that idea of saying, okay, do your thing, but we don't think that we should negotiate, it's a very radical statement that helped me to understand, for me, the movement in between decolonial, so moving from the plantation, and the counter-colonial, staying out of the plantation. So that kind of double movement have been very nourishing for me, and Brazil context is very rich for us on that perspective. Cindy, I'll ask you the last words just to finish.
What a responsibility. We're talking about responsibility. I mean, maybe similarly to what Afrah says, sometimes, what we experience as well and what we, kind of think about, experience, sorry, I'm repeating myself, or come across with, don't always have to be articulated, in such a concrete, tangible sense. And I feel like this moment in Salvador was very much that as well for me. It's maybe something that plants the seed for other ways of thinking, of doing, and again, becoming better human in many senses, or more than human, as you say, Olivier. So I feel like the three of you have kind of summarized a little bit the way that I feel, and really kind of maybe a point that we didn't have a chance to expand on so much was also what does our presence in such a place, such as Salvador, represents? What does it mean, for local people, the local ecosystem that a city like Salvador is currently? And maybe there is a sort of, again, responsibility in the ways in which ourselves as artists and curators really also determine a certain ethics of spending time somewhere, and how our practice either connects, complements, or again, counteract in many sense. I mean, I like the word counteract because I feel like it's something that needs to be done more and more as a kind of gesture of resistance because of the state of the world as well right now. We need to counteract mediatic messages. We need to counteract, narrow-minded mentalities. We need to, counteract fascist politics. I mean, there are so many counteraction that are needed on the everyday. that perhaps it's also about understanding, where we are situated, how do we occupy a space without occupying it. And I think Salvador in itself, being in the context of a, let's say, contemporary art environment, there is unavoidably textures of that, coloniality, of that friction, tension with an environment like Salvador as well. Being from outside, creating something from outside, but also, again, the ecosystem in which we navigate. And I think we have to be really open, but also have a clear vision that we are also implicated in a certain environments, professional environments, and what that means locally, and wherever we are. So, what do we contribute, basically? What is our contribution? What is our position? What is our privilege within that? But also, how do we activate something that also creates a sort of ethics of relations with everyone, with every spaces, every sites, in the long term or in the short term, in the case of a residency. So we are interesting actors wherever we go, I think, in what we bring, the embodied knowledge and experiences that we bring in those different contexts as well. So that's maybe a bit of a practice, or in principle, to be carried forward as we go, as we think, projects and spaces, and because it's more urgent than ever right now, I think.
Thank you, Cindy. It was a very nice word to finish, and that's open to a lot of perspective. We know that we will find steps to do things. Sometimes we're afraid about how huge is the task, but we have to reflect also how to experience one thing after the other. So find a path towards another humanity. And so this is urgent, but in a way we have also to find the right techniques, not to be totally overwhelmed by that emergency. And so I think we did that, and I think that residency have been a very good contribution of our own experience about that. Thank you all for that. Thank you for the Atlantic thread